can I get an usted?
Usted.
Can I get an ustedes?
Ustedes.
If I catch any of you sick.
How do you say you in Spanish? People learning Spanish often struggle to wrap their heads around the second person pronoun. One reason being that it varies substantially from one region to another. In Spain, there's a four-way split depending on number and level of formality. So you have tú and usted, ustedes, and vosotros. In Latin America, of course, they also have the singular plural distinction, but rather than having two special plural forms, there's only one, ustedes, which pulls double duty. And to make matters more complicated, here in Latin America, there's a secret additional pronoun that many people who are learning are never even told about. Vos. So in this video, we're going to try and answer 3 questions. Why are there different pronoun systems in Spain versus in the Americas? What is vos and when and where is it used? And when do native speakers use usted? And I guarantee that the answer to at least one of these questions is going to surprise you. Side note, when I mention Spanish verbs and pronouns, I'm going to do my best to pronounce them accurately. But when it comes to the countries, I'm just going to say them in English because I don't know. I think that just seems like the least douchey option for me personally. But I respect your right to be angry at that. It is the internet after all. So if you're thinking that vos looks suspiciously similar to vosotros, your intuition is correct. And that's where the story begins. So before the otros got added, vos was just the regular old second person plural pronoun inherited directly from Latin as it transitioned into Spanish. Now, why and how would the plural vos of medieval Spain end up becoming the modern singular vos of, say, wherever Juanes is from? Well, as usual, we can blame the Romans. Starting in Latin way back in the day, there was a custom of referring to the emperor using the plural pronoun vos. The basic idea seems to be bestowing extra honor on someone who's in a high position by using a plural pronoun to refer to a singular person. So later that tradition got extended to other respected people like this guy and this guy. And eventually by the 1300s, there was a complete developed system of using this plural pronoun to refer to singular people when you wanted to show them honor. By the way, the situation in French has basically remained the exact same way, where nowadays you have tu, which is the informal singular second person pronoun, and then vous serves as the plural and as the way of showing honor to a singular person. Well, I'm glad you asked because that's where things start to take some twists. But first, something very important about language change that people often get wrong, specifically with the, let's say, more colonially active languages. There's this misconception that those languages, as they're spoken in their original countries, English in England, French in France, Spanish in Spain, that they remain frozen in time and they didn't change. And if there's any changes between those languages and the ones spoken in the Americas, it's the ones in the Americas that experienced all the change. And while it's definitely true that there were new pronunciations, grammatical innovations, and even new vocabulary that came up in the colonies, in reality, language is constantly evolving. So just like there were changes taking place in the New World at that time, back in Europe, other changes were also taking place, causing the divide to be even greater. For example, as part of a broader trend that happened in the other Romance languages, we see otros begin to be added to vos to specify that it was plural, because apparently using vos as a singular started to give the plurality a watered down feeling. It just didn't hit the same as a plural pronoun anymore. So vosotros came to replace it entirely as the default second person plural. And it's at this time that we see a split in the conjugation, which leads to different conjugated forms of vos in Latin America and vosotros in Europe, which we'll see in a little bit. So at the same time that vos began to lose its force as a plural pronoun in Europe, it also started to lose its force as a respectful pronoun. And so to make it even more respectful, the title vuestra merced, meaning your grace or your mercy, began to be used more commonly to express respect for someone in authority. And if that seems like a ridiculous way of referring to someone in a position of authority, you're correct. However, we do something similar in English.
Your Honor, objection!
So the term vuestra merced has several contracted forms that you find documented over the course of centuries. Vuestra merced, você, but eventually it settled in on the one that you're familiar with, usted. And along with its plural ustedes, those two became the default respectful forms of address for people in authority. Meanwhile, at the same time in Latin America, as Spanish spread into the continent, so spread tú, usted, and vos in the singular and ustedes in the plural. And when it comes to the distribution of these words, remember the language was in flux back in Europe, and those colonists were populating the continent at different times, coming from different regions, and this was in successive waves over decades and centuries. So while in Latin America, ustedes is universal as the plural pronoun, and usted is widely recognized as the singular deferential, there's a lot of random distribution when it comes to where vos and tú took root and where they continue to blossom. Now, let's take a moment to take stock and list the places where vos has a prominent role in order roughly of how hard they go. We have Argentina, Nicaragua, Uruguay, Paraguay, Honduras, Costa Rica, Guatemala, El Salvador, Bolivia, Chile, and Colombia, Ecuador, Venezuela, Panama, and Peru. The tricky part is because the use of tú, vos, and usted is so intimately tied into closeness with someone, but also respect and professionalism, the way things settled in ended up painting a very complicated picture when we look at the Spanish-speaking world as a whole. For example, most Spanish speakers will agree that usted shows a level of respect to the person that you're speaking with, but some people would also say that it expresses distance to that person, and it can be used as a way of holding someone at arm's length or of rejecting intimacy with that person. So in practice, unsurprisingly, every region and really even every speaker has developed their own set of customs and practices that determine when and with whom they use those pronouns. For example, in Argentina, vos is used pretty much universally, even in the most formal situations. Meanwhile, in Costa Rica, the overwhelming majority of individuals most of the time use usted with each other. And that includes family members and friends. So husbands and wives use usted with each other. Children use usted with their parents. Parents use it with their children. According to some research, up to 80% of the time, speakers in Costa Rica address one another using usted, the remaining time being vos. And in much of the rest of Central America, there's a three-way system that's developed where vos seems to indicate the closest level of intimacy, usted shows the highest level of respect, but the highest level of distance, and tú is somewhere in between. So one of the things that gets overlooked when talking about vos a lot of the times is the verb forms. The verb forms for vos derive from the original vos verb forms that were inherited from Latin. But if you're not familiar with those, it may be easier to think of them in relation to their corresponding tú forms. Although there is a fair amount of regional variation when it comes to the concrete conjugation, and I'll have some resources in the links that talk more about specific regions and the ways that they conjugate these verbs. But for most verbs, coming from someone who knows the tú forms, the first thing you'll notice is the shift in stress to the syllable with the ending. That's the final syllable of the verb.
¿Qué mira, bobo? Anda para allá, bobo. Anda para allá.
Additionally, you'll notice that IR verbs that end in ir, have a thematic E in the ending rather than having the A that you may be familiar with from the tú form. Relatedly, for verbs that have a vowel changing stem, you'll notice that they don't have that vowel change because the stress no longer falls on that syllable. So instead of puedes, you have podés. Instead of tienes, you have tenés. Instead of vuelves, you have volvés. And additionally, there's a couple of verb forms that are completely different that you'll just have to memorize if you're interested in learning this. For example, you have sois or sos, you have decime instead of dime, and you have vení acá instead of ven acá. Interestingly, in some areas such as Chile and Guatemala, they can use these same vos verb forms, but use the pronoun tú before them. So you may hear things like tú sabes or tú podís. And conversely, in some areas, the tú conjugated forms can be accompanied by the pronoun vos. The last and for me possibly most confusing thing is that even if a speaker has 100% voseo, that is to say they always use vos as the personal pronoun and they always conjugate their verbs according to vos, you'll still hear them say tú. How is that possible? Well, it's because the pronoun paradigm for vos and tú have gotten so inextricably linked that the possessive pronoun for vos is always tú. Likewise, the corresponding object pronoun is always te. So let's look at some examples to illustrate how that pronoun paradigm works in practice.
¿Vos tenés novia?
¿Tenés novio?
No.
¿Estás casada?
No, no.
¿Tenés hijos?
No, tampoco.
¿Te gustan las chicas?
No, no, no es eso.
So there you have it. Everything I could possibly fit into one video about pronouns. Let me know if there's any important details that you think I missed, or if there's any important questions that you still have about this stuff, and maybe I'll have to make a follow-up. If there's anyone interested in this, I can honestly do a video about each of these specific regions because there's even more details, honestly, that I couldn't get into. And I'd be really interested to hear from anyone who speaks any variety of Spanish to see what you think about this topic. And remember to like, subscribe, and leave a comment. See you guys next time. ¿Cómo vos te llamas? Iré con vos. Cállate vos. Andate.